Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you can be here despite the stormy weather. We've heard from one of our speakers today that he's already seen half a tree come down in the next garden. So we hope everybody's going to get safely through this experience and not have to attend to any tree emergencies. So my name is Tina Fawcett. I'm a senior researcher in the energy policy team at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And I'm here because I'm a co-I of the EPSRC Network Plus for decarbonisation of heating and cooling. And that, in fact, is the network which is putting on this event. It's the second one we've done this year. And it's part of a series where we're looking at different challenges of decarbonising heating and cooling sectors and behaviours and policy and legal aspects and many different aspects of this huge challenge that we've all got. This week we've got two speakers on the subject of geothermal warmth and the future of home heating. And they're going to be providing thoughts from a regulatory and from a policy perspective. We're aiming to continue this monthly seminar series as a way of exchanging knowledge and building community on these issues. It's been very popular so far. We hope that continues to be the case. Please get in touch with feedback. If you've got any suggestions for future speakers, if you'd like to propose yourself as a future speaker, that's great. And if you're not already on our mailing list, then please do ask to be added. And so then you will get full information about what's coming up next, because webinars are not the only thing that we do as a network. So there's other events you might be interested in too. So our first speaker today is Dr. Anna McLean. She's a researcher at Newcastle University and she's working on the excellently named Net Zero Geordie project. So this is an EPSRC funded project that's part of their decarbonising heating and cooling programme. So this research project, like many of these projects, is bringing together researchers from a number of universities. In this case, it's Newcastle, Glasgow and Durham. And it's examining the viability of the use of geothermal energy for heating and cooling of buildings. It involves investigating the extraction of geothermal energy and its integration into whole energy systems. Anna's has a legal background and her role is to examine the regulatory and legal implications of the extraction and use of geothermal energy. We will now give the floor to Anna to hear about geothermal energy and the regulatory framework.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Tina. Yes, so as Tina mentioned, this is a presentation about geothermal energy and its use for heating buildings, particularly homes, and it's focusing on the legal and regulatory aspects of that use of geothermal energy. So just to reiterate that I am legally trained, I'm not, I don't have the technical sort of background of geothermal energy. It's sort of my legal perspective that I'm bringing to this presentation. And again, as Tina mentioned, it comes out of research that's been carried out in this Net Zero Geordie project. That's a Newcastle University-led consortium funded by the EPSRC as part of the programme to decarbonise heating and cooling, and it involves not just Newcastle University, but also researchers from Glasgow and Durham universities. And it's investigating the extraction of geothermal energy using a closed loop extraction system and the integration of geothermal energy into whole energy systems. It's based around a 1.6 kilometre deep borehole at Newcastle Helix site, and that's being used as a research facility. And it's exploring the potential for that to be used to meet the heating and cooling needs of commercial university buildings on site, and also some residential properties that are going to be built just next to it. And the idea being that it will act as a pilot for, that could lead to the reuse of onshore boreholes, enabling them to be used for heating and cooling and geothermal power. So obviously the research project involves investigation into the technical aspects of geothermal energy, its integration into heating networks, and we have engineers and geoscientists looking at that. But it also raises questions regarding the law. If we're going to start extracting and using geothermal energy, what does that mean in terms of the law? What regulation is there in place and the operators of geothermal projects need to comply with, and what regulation is there in place that protects and incentivizes geothermal projects and helps the industry to grow? And that's sort of where I come into the research project. So as I said, I'm a solicitor by training, and then I kind of moved across to academia, doing a master's in environmental regulation and sustainable development, and then a PhD looking at planning law to manage flood risks. So basically, my work looks at the application of the law to environmental issues and emerging technology and techniques that can be used to address those issues. So that's what this presentation will focus on. It will look at how the extraction use of geothermal energy is regulated. It'll highlight some of the issues with that, with how it's currently regulated, and discussion about whether there might be a better way to regulate it. So before I jump in, I'm going to give a quick introduction to geothermal energy and why it's important. There may be many of you watching this, listening to this, that already have considerable knowledge about this, but it just gives a bit of context to the presentation. So geothermal energy is the heat stored beneath the Earth's surface. Deep geothermal energy is heat radiating from the Earth's core, and the deeper you go, the hotter it gets. And shallow geothermal energy is the heat in the first 500 meters below the surface, and this comes largely from the sun and underground infrastructure. It's cooler than deep geothermal energy, but it's still useful. So that energy, that geothermal energy, can be extracted and used for heating and cooling and for the generation of power. It's particularly useful for heating of buildings because higher temperature geothermal energy is needed to produce the generation of power. We can use the more accessible, the shallower. You don't have to drill as deep, basically, to access resources that can be used for heating of buildings. And also we have this significant proportion of the UK's carbon emissions which come from the heating of buildings. So if we can decarbonize heating, then obviously we can make a significant contribution to meeting net zero targets. And it has been estimated that the UK has plentiful geothermal resources. It's been estimated, sufficient geothermal resources to meet heating requirements for 100 years. So we've got plenty of these resources accessible and plenty of scope for them to be used, therefore. Before I look at how, as I say, this presentation is about how geothermal energy is regulated. And before I go on to look at how it's regulated, it's just important to explain why we need to regulate it, what aspects of it we need to regulate. So basically, in order to extract geothermal energy, you have to dig one or more wells or boreholes. And obviously that has implications for the environment in terms of affecting ecosystems of the soil and surface and air and noise pollution, and there are visual impacts. And then geothermal energy is extracted using either an open loop system that extracts water from the ground, transfers it through pipes in the ground, with the water, after the heat's been extracted from it, being discharged back into the ground or surface water. So there's obviously environmental implications there in terms of water levels and potential pollution issues. If the water being discharged back into the ground or surface water contains chemicals such as antifreeze, which sometimes the fluid running through the geothermal system might contain. And obviously the extraction and discharge of large amounts of water can carry risk of seismic activity, subsidence and what have you. Alternatively, a closed loop system can be used for extraction of geothermal energy, where basically this, generally speaking, have less implications for the environment, as they don't involve the abstraction and discharge of water and geothermal fluid, but just continually circulate the same water within a closed loop system. But they do carry some risk of pollution from pipeline leakage, noise pollution. They're not totally without environmental risk. And as well as the environmental impacts that need to be regulated, there's also the extraction of the actual resource. So who has the right to extract the heat and how much can they extract? And this is important because if someone is investing in a geothermal operation that relies on being able to extract a certain amount of heat in order to be economically viable, then if another operator sets up nearby and they start extracting heat, then that could reduce the amount of heat that's available to the first geothermal operation. And people are not going to be reluctant to invest in geothermal operations if there's a risk that this is going to happen, if the geothermal energy available to them for extraction could be reduced. So that's a brief summary of why we need to regulate geothermal operations. We need to ensure that they don't become an environmental problem in themselves, and we need to ensure that operators know that they'll be able to extract the amounts of heat that they need for the lifetime of the operation. So, as with many many emerging industries. The case at the moment is we don't have specific laws for geothermal energy. We have a number of laws that have been developed to apply to other industries and practices and technology that cover some of the aspects of geothermal energy. And some of those key pieces of law are those listed there on the slide. So we've got Water Resources Act, under which a geothermal operation that extracts more than 20 cubic meters of water a day will need a license from the Environment Agency. And we have environmental permitting regulations, under which geothermal operations that involve the extraction and discharge of large amounts of water, that involve the discharge of geothermal fluid, will need a permit from the Environment Agency. So those two pieces of legislation combined really only apply to open loop systems, the extraction and discharge of water and geothermal fluid. If you've got a closed loop system that doesn't involve that extraction and discharge of large amounts of water, then they're not going to come within those two regulatory regimes. So in addition to regulation by the Environment Agency, we also have the town and country planning regime. And under that regime, you've got planning permission being needed for development. So this applies whether the operation is a closed loop or open loop system. This is generally applicable to all development. And when deciding whether to grant planning permission for geothermal development, the local authority will look at the environmental implications and decide whether to grant it planning permission or not. And if it does decide to grant planning permission, then it can attach conditions to mitigate the environmental impacts. It can set emissions limits and address the visual impacts. And larger scale geothermal operations, those that are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment, will require an environmental impact assessment, and therefore will involve basically an expert assessment of the environmental implications. The limitation of the use of local authorities and the town and country planning regime to manage the environmental impacts of geothermal operations is that local authorities, they're not there just to protect the environment. Okay, they are there when they're deciding whether to grant planning permission or not. They're carrying out a balancing exercise, and they're taking into account environmental risks. They're also taking into account economic and social benefits. So they are allowed to grant planning permission for a project, even if it will have considerable adverse environmental impacts. So they may decide that the economic or social benefits that it's going to bring outweigh the detrimental environmental impacts, and therefore grant it planning permission. So they have that ability to regulate to mitigate, to make sure that measures are taken to mitigate the environmental impacts, but they're not required to, and they certainly aren't required to prevent, adverse environmental impacts from development. So that was looking at the environmental, a very brief overview of regulation of the environmental impacts of geothermal energy. Now going to move on to have a look at the extent to which, whether the law gives any protection for operators of geothermal projects from interference with the amount of energy that there is available for them to extract. Again, there's no specific law for this, and what we have is a number of existing laws that we need to look at to see what they mean for giving operators guaranteed access to geothermal resources. And we have the Infrastructure Act, and that gives everyone the right to access and extract deep geothermal energy. So basically sort of giving it the status of a common resource that can be accessed by anyone. So, you can come along and you can start accessing it, but everyone else has the right to come and access and extract and use that geothermal resource as well. And we have the water extraction licensing regime, which I mentioned a moment ago, and that can regulate the amount of water that the license holder can abstract. The license will give the geothermal operator permission to extract a specific amount of water, but it doesn't regulate the amount of heat that they can extract. And similarly, the environmental permitting regime regulates the discharge of heat in terms of when you're discharging a geothermal fluid back into the ground in an open loop system. It will regulate that fluid, and due to the sort of the heat pollution aspects of geothermal fluid, but that's to do with discharge of heat. It's not to do with the extraction of the heat. So it's looking at heat as a pollutant rather than a resource, regulating it in terms of putting heat back into the ground where it may affect ecosystems, as opposed to regulating the amount of heat that's extracted from it in the first place. And then the other sort of potential means by which a geothermal operator might have some protection of a geothermal resource if they start an operation is they may be able to make a nuisance claim against another operator that sets up in the vicinity and starts extracting heat, and therefore and by doing so interfering with the amount of heat that first geothermal operator has available to them. But the problem is with that, and I don't want to go into technical land law with you here, but basically a nuisance claim can only be made if a proprietary right is interfered with. So if geothermal operator number one, if their proprietary interest has been interfered with, proprietary interest in the land has been interfered with by geothermal operator number two, then they could make a nuisance claim. The problem with that is the way that geothermal energy is categorized at the moment. It's not something that the geothermal operator will have a proprietary interest in. They have a right to access it and a right to access it, but they don't have a proprietary interest in it. So that limits or prevents really the nuisance being able to be used as a means for a geothermal operator to protect the amount of resource that is available to them to extract. So what we can see from that very brief summary of the regulation of geothermal energy is that there are some significant gaps in the regulation, and that they leave some significant aspects of geothermal energy unregulated. And this is likely to have a detrimental impact on the ability of the industry to expand. The lack of robust environmental regulation can be a barrier to public support, and the risk of having your access to geothermal resources interfered with by other operations in the area is a deterrent to investors. It makes investment risky, especially given the high costs of drilling and construction for geothermal operations. So does this mean that we need to look at reforming the law so that we can start to encourage more use of geothermal energy? And if so, how should it be reformed? And there are various different options, possibilities for this. So one option would be to sort of reform the environmental permitting regimes so that all geothermal developments require a permit from the Environment Agency, not just those that are involved in the discharge of large quantities of water. And that would, by bringing all geothermal operations into the environmental permitting regime, it would enable the Environment Agency to manage the environmental impacts of all geothermal operations. So that's one option for managing the environmental impacts. Other options include setting up a brand new regulator just to regulate geothermal operations. Another option might be to take a slightly more hands-off approach initially and to develop a series of good practices and guidance for geothermal operators, certainly perhaps in the early stages of this sort of the expansion of the industry, rather than taking the sort of the actual formal permitting option. And then, so far as a licensing regime for heat is concerned, it is important that there's some way to ensure that operators are given access to the amount of geothermal energy that they need. And one way to do this would to have a sort of a licensing regime, like there is in place for the extraction of petroleum and water, in fact, as well, so that a geothermal operator can apply for a license, and that gives them the exclusive right to extract from a particular resource, or the right to extract a specific amount of heat from a specific geothermal reservoir. The sort of the main stumbling block that we have with that approach at the moment is that we don't actually, in the UK, know who owns geothermal energy. In order to have a licensing system that grants exclusive rights to extract geothermal energy, then we need to know who owns it. The person who grants the license has the right to do so. And currently in the UK, geothermal energy isn't regarded as owned by anyone, not by the state, not by the person who owns land within which it is found. As I discussed a moment ago, we've got the Infrastructure Act, which basically gives everyone the right to access it. So it might be that there has to be a vesting of ownership of geothermal resources in the state, sort of taking the model that's been used for petroleum, where the ownership of petroleum resources was vested in the state, and then the state grants the licenses to operators to extract it. Again, the sort of, I guess, the note of caution here is that setting up a geothermal project is expensive and it's time consuming. The initial investment costs are high, and it takes a long time before geothermal operation is going to be up and running. So what we don't want to do when we look at reform to the regulatory regime is to create a lengthy and expensive licensing system that's going to add to this time, cost, expense, time for geothermal operations, because that's just going to deter rather than encourage investors. So there are a number of options to consider and issues that need to be addressed before deciding what's the best way to regulate geothermal energy in a way that mitigates the environmental impacts, whilst also encouraging the growth of the industry so that it can start fulfilling its potential to be a really significant contributor to the achievement of net zero. And that's what we're continuing to look at and to think about and to weigh up and to put forward the different options. So thank you for listening to my very brief summary of the legal regulation of geothermal energy. This slide here is basically it's got the website on for the Net Zero Geordie project, and it's got some additional contact details there just in case anyone's wanting to get in touch.